Hello and welcome to Cluster Fudge, the podcast where we dive deep into the stories, facts and voices that shape America, unfiltered, unvarnished and unapologetically real. I'm your host Alexandra, and today we're honouring some of America's most important yet often overlooked figures, America's Foremothers. We all know the name Betsy Ross, the woman credited with sewing the first American flag. But who was she really? And who were the other women who helped lay the foundations of this country? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on myth, exploring the realities of women's contributions during the birth of the United States, and shining a light on these powerful, brave, and inspiring foremothers. So buckle up. This one's going to be a rich ride. All right, let's start right where most people do. Betsy Ross. The name instantly conjures an image of a brave seamstress, quietly crafting the very first American flag in her modest Philadelphia home. The story goes something like this. In 1776, Betsy Ross was approached by George Washington himself, alongside Robert Morris and George Ross, to sew a flag for the newly declared United States of America. She's said to have suggested the five-pointed star because it was easier to sew, and voila, the iconic stars and stripes were born. It's a beautiful story, patriotic, simple, easy to remember, and it's been ingrained in American folklore, school textbooks and popular culture for well over a century. But here's the twist. The historical evidence backing this story is surprisingly thin. Most historians agree that the tale of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag emerged almost a century after the Revolutionary War ended, largely through the efforts of her grandson, William J. Canby. In 1870, Canby presented a paper to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, recounting family stories and claiming Betsy's pivotal role. But, and this is key, there are no contemporary records from the 1770s that document Betsy Ross's involvement with the first flag. No letters, no official orders, no diaries or newspaper reports mention her as the designer or maker of the first stars and stripes. In fact, Betsy Ross herself never claimed this honour during her lifetime. The story surfaced only through oral family history decades later. Historians caution that family legends can sometimes be romanticised or exaggerated. Betsy Ross, born Elizabeth Griscom in 1752, was a skilled upholsterer and flag maker in Philadelphia. She married John Ross, a fellow upholsterer and patriot, and after his death she took over the family business. We know from records that Betsy Ross made flags during the Revolutionary War, a common and vital task. Flags were essential for communication, rallying troops, and signalling identity on battlefields. Philadelphia was a hotbed of revolutionary activity, and many women contributed by sewing flags, uniforms, and other supplies for the Continental Army. Betsy Ross was among these women, and her business records and receipts support that she was an established flag maker. The first official American flag design is often attributed to the Continental Congress's flag resolution on June 14, 1777, which stated, "Resolved that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation." However, the resolution did not specify the star shape, arrangement, or exact design, leaving much to local interpretation. Several other individuals have been credited historically or speculated to have influenced or designed the first flag, including Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a designer who claimed to have created the flag and seal designs. Rebecca Young, another flag maker who supplied military standards. Others, like Betsy's contemporaries in Philadelphia and beyond, who likely contributed to early flag production. In truth, the flag we recognise today evolved over time, influenced by multiple hands and designs. If the story is uncertain, why has Betsy Ross become the symbol of American female patriotism? There are a few reasons. First, cultural narratives love heroes and heroines, especially stories that are easy to tell and teach. A single relatable figure like Betsy Ross helps personify a national symbol, making history feel tangible. Second, the late 19th century saw a rise in patriotic nationalism, especially after the Civil War. The Betsy Ross legend fit perfectly into a unifying American story, celebrating the revolution and emphasizing women's contributions. Third, her story highlights women's often invisible work in the founding of America. Whether or not she sewed the very first flag, Betsy Ross's legacy shines a light on countless women who laboured behind the scenes. What's more important than the myth itself is what it represents. Women like Betsy Ross played essential roles in supporting the revolution, sewing flags, uniforms, raising funds, managing households and farms, nursing the wounded and more. Their labour was often unrecognised officially, but critical to the survival and morale of the revolutionary cause. So what do we take away from the Betsy Ross story? Not necessarily to discard it as false, but to appreciate it as a powerful symbol. A symbol that opens the door to a much larger conversation about women's roles in early America. It's also a reminder to question popular history, dig deeper, and seek out the untold stories. Because America's foremothers were many, and their contributions were vital. And Betsy Ross, myth or reality, helps us remember that. Coming up next, we'll explore some of these other foremothers. The Molly Pitchers, Abigail Adamses, Phyllis Wheatleys, and Deborah Sampsons, women whose stories challenge and expand our understanding of the revolution. Stay tuned. Now that we've unpacked the legend of Betsy Ross, let's take a much broader look at the many, many roles women played in the American Revolution, roles that history books have often glossed over or forgotten entirely. The revolution wasn't just fought on battlefields by men with muskets. It was a full-scale social upheaval, and women were at its heart wearing many hats, from nurses and fundraisers to spies and soldiers in disguise. Their courage and resilience were vital to the colony's ultimate success. Let's dive into some of these roles. 1. The home front, keeping the nation running. First and foremost, many women were the backbone of the home front. With so many men off fighting, women stepped in to manage farms, businesses, and households under extraordinary pressure. Imagine this: your husband or father leaves to fight the British, and you're left with everything: feeding the family, tending to the fields, repairing homes, and managing finances, often with limited resources and constant threat of raids or shortages. Women had to be resourceful. They learned to make do with less, invent substitutes for scarce goods, and keep communities stable. Without this labour, the revolutionary effort would have faltered. 2. Nursing and medical care war means injury and illness, and the medical care in the 18th century was primitive at best. Women often stepped up as nurses, caregivers, and healers, tending to wounded soldiers with whatever they had on hand. Take Margaret Corbin, who, after her husband was killed during the Battle of Fort Washington in 1776, took his place at the cannon and fought bravely. But earlier, she also cared for wounded men on the battlefield. Many women learned basic medical skills, becoming vital in field hospitals, often risking their own safety to care for the sick and dying. 3. Spies and secret agents. Women also served as spies and messengers, using society's underestimation of them to gather intelligence and pass critical information to the Continental Army. One remarkable figure is Agent 355, an anonymous woman spy associated with the Culper Ring, a key intelligence network in New York during the Revolution. Women could slip into social gatherings unnoticed, overhear loyalist conversations, and relay details about troop movements, all while flying under the radar because they were considered non-threatening. Their bravery and cunning were crucial in espionage efforts. 4. Fundraisers and political activists. Women also mobilized political and financial support for the revolution. Groups like the Daughters of Liberty organized boycotts of British goods, making homespun cloth to replace taxed British textiles. They held fundraisers, made ammunition, and encouraged communities to support the cause in any way possible. Their activism wasn't just economic, it was deeply political, asserting a new kind of power through consumer choices and collective action. 5. Combatants in disguise. Some women took the most radical step of all, disguising themselves as men to fight on the front lines. Deborah Sampson is one of the most famous examples. She dressed as a man, Robert Shirtliff, and enlisted in the Continental Army, serving for over a year before her identity was discovered. Her story is extraordinary, but she was not alone. Historians have documented dozens of women who disguised themselves to fight alongside men. This defiance of gender norms showed incredible courage and a deep commitment to the revolutionary cause. 6. Symbolic figures and inspirational voices. Women also inspired revolution through their words and example. Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, famously wrote letters urging her husband to remember the ladies when forming the new government. Her correspondence reflects the early stirrings of women's rights and political consciousness. And Phyllis Wheatley, the first published African-American female poet, wrote poems that celebrated liberty and challenged notions of race and humanity. These voices helped shape the intellectual and cultural currents of the revolution. 7. Supporting soldiers and communities. Beyond formal roles, women did the vital work of maintaining morale. They organised communal meals, supported widows and orphans, and kept the spirit of resistance alive. Their sacrifices often went unnoticed, but their contribution was emotional and practical, holding families and communities together in tumultuous times. Take Molly Pitcher, a nickname given to women who carried water to soldiers during battle, but the most famous Molly is Mary Ludwig Hayes. She supposedly took over firing a cannon after her husband was injured at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. Her bravery became legendary, and she was honoured by the Continental Congress. So when we talk about the American Revolution, we must remember it was a collective effort, and women were not on the sidelines. Women were the backbone of the colonial resistance, organising boycotts, managing farms, and keeping the home fires burning. Their contributions, though often undocumented, were essential to the revolutionary cause. They managed farms, nursed the sick, gathered intelligence, fought in disguise, and fueled the political will of the colonies. Their bravery and ingenuity remind us that history is never just the story of famous men on battlefields. It's also the story of those who nurtured, resisted, and transformed from every corner. Next, we'll explore the political limitations women faced after the revolution and how they carved out influence despite those boundaries. Stay with me. So far, we've looked at the myth of Betsy Ross and the many roles women played during the revolution. But what happened when the dust settled, when the colonies won and America was officially born? Did women get a seat at the table? Let's be blunt. No. Not only were women excluded from the political systems they had helped birth, but many of the ideals they'd fought for, liberty, equality, representation, were actively denied to them. This is the part of the story where hope and hypocrisy collide. But, as you'll see, American women didn't just accept that exclusion. They got creative, they got loud, and they laid the foundation for future generations of activism. Let's unpack it all. 1. The political shutout. Who got a voice in the new republic? The US Constitution, ratified in 1789, did not mention women as political participants. Citizenship was defined in gender-neutral terms, but political rights, like voting or holding office, were left up to the states and overwhelmingly reserved for white, landowning men. Even in states like New Jersey, where women property owners briefly had the right to vote from 1776 to 1807, that right was quickly rescinded once women, especially single educated ones, started showing up at the polls. In most states, women were legally invisible in matters of governance. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, and were largely considered the legal property of their husbands once married, under what's called coverture law. This wasn't a minor oversight. This was a systemic exclusion. The American political structure was built on liberty, but it drew a firm line at gender. 2. Informal influence, the power behind the curtain. And yet, women found ways to exert power. Politics didn't end at the ballot box, and women knew it. They became masters of what we might now call soft power. They influenced their husbands, sons, and brothers, often shaping opinions in the home before they ever reached the town hall. Women wrote letters, hosted salons, and circulated political pamphlets. They gathered in homes and church groups to discuss political ideas, becoming conduits for revolutionary ideology. Think of Abigail Adams writing to her husband John Adams as he helped draft the nation's laws. Her letters weren't just casual correspondence, they were bold, reasoned arguments. Remember the ladies, she wrote in 1776. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Abigail wasn't just expressing concern, she was laying the intellectual foundation for future feminist demands. And she wasn't alone. 3. Salons. Letters and pen names, the rise of the female public intellectual. Many elite women became informal intellectual leaders. They used the tools available, literacy, correspondence publishing, to influence public discourse. Mercy Otis Warren, a political writer and historian, published plays, poems, and pamphlets attacking British rule and supporting the revolution. Later, she wrote History of the Rise, Progress and Termination of the American Revolution, one of the first comprehensive accounts of the conflict from a woman's perspective. Other women, often writing anonymously or under pseudonyms, challenged gender norms and advocated for women's education and political consideration. These efforts weren't just symbolic. They shaped public opinion, moved ideas, and questioned the boundaries of women's roles in the Republic. 4. Republican motherhood, empowerment, or containment. After the war, a new cultural ideal emerged called Republican motherhood. The idea that women's most important political role was to raise virtuous, informed citizens, particularly sons who would one day vote and lead. At first glance, this seems empowering, a recognition that women had a role to play in the health of the nation. But dig deeper, and it's more complicated. Republican motherhood restricted women's influence to the domestic sphere, reinforcing traditional gender roles while using patriotic language to make them sound progressive. It told women, you're not needed at the podium or the polling booth. You're needed in the kitchen, moulding the minds of future leaders. Yes, it opened doors for better education for girls, but it also firmly closed doors to actual political power. It was an ideological box, painted red, white, and blue. Resistance and the seeds of feminism. Still, even within these limitations, women resisted. They used their roles as mothers and wives not just to reinforce the status quo, but to challenge it. They began asking, if I must raise informed citizens, shouldn't I be one too? If I must teach liberty, why can't I live it? These questions didn't spark a full-blown feminist movement right away, but they laid the ideological groundwork. Women began forming reading societies, publishing essays, and organizing. Over time, these efforts would evolve into the suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, and the fight for women's legal and economic autonomy. It all began here, in this era of exclusion, where women learn to influence from the margins. So let's be clear, women were cut out of formal political power in early America. The laws didn't serve them, the Constitution didn't protect them, the founding ideals excluded them. But women didn't stay silent. They wrote, they spoke, they taught, they resisted, and in doing so, they shaped the American experiment, even if they weren't invited to the table. Their influence was subtle, strategic, and subversive. It bent the arc of the young nation towards something more just, even if slowly. Coming up next, we'll meet some of the lesser-known foremothers whose actions shaped America's trajectory. From poets to fighters to lawyers and rebels, these women were more than just shadows behind the men. They were forces of history in their own right. Stay with me. As we continue to peel back the layers of American history, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Betsy Ross was never alone. She was one face among many. A symbol, yes, but one of countless women whose courage, intellect, and determination helped shape this nation. And yet, most of these women have been footnotes. If mentioned at all, they are sidelined in textbooks and rarely given the spotlight they deserve. So, in this segment, I want to bring these hidden heroines forward. These are the foremothers we must remember, not because they fit a patriotic mould, but because they pushed against it. Let's meet them. 1. Phyllis Wheatley, the revolutionary poet. Let's start with someone truly remarkable. Phyllis Wheatley. Enslaved as a child and brought to Boston, Wheatley became the first African-American woman and only the third American woman to publish a book of poetry. In 1773, at just 20 years old, her collection, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was published in London. Her poetry did more than display genius. It was political. In it, she spoke of freedom, divine justice, and the shared humanity of enslaved people and their oppressors. Here's the twist. George Washington read and admired her work. She wrote him a poem praising his leadership, and he responded with an invitation to visit him in person. Wheatley's mere existence defied the logic of slavery, an enslaved black woman articulating Enlightenment ideals and revolutionary values at a time when her very life was owned. She was living proof that liberty had to expand or collapse under its own hypocrisy. 2. Mercy Otis Warren, the pen behind the revolution. Mercy Otis Warren, often called the conscience of the American Revolution. Warren was a playwright, historian, and political thinker, unofficial advisor to patriots like Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. But she didn't just take dictation, she shaped ideas. She used her pen to criticize British tyranny and urge resistance. Her plays mocked British officials. Her pamphlets inspired revolutionaries. And in 1805, she became the first woman to publish a comprehensive history of the American Revolution. This was radical. A woman not only writing history, but influencing it. Mercy believed that virtue, not violence, was the true measure of a republic. Her voice reminds us that revolutions are not just fought with muskets, but with ideas. 3. Deborah Sampson, the warrior in disguise. Now let's talk about someone who refused to stay behind the scenes. Deborah Sampson, a Massachusetts woman who disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army under the name Robert Shirtliff. She served for over a year, surviving wounds and disease. When her identity was eventually discovered, she was honorably discharged and later petitioned Congress for a pension, which she received. Deborah's story is not a romantic novelty. It's a bold rejection of the rules society tried to place on her body and mind. In a time when women were told their only battlefield was the home, she chose the literal battlefield. Her bravery paved the way for future generations of women in uniform. 4. Nancy Ward Nyehi, the Cherokee diplomat and peacekeeper. Let's expand beyond the colonial patriots and meet Nanyehi, known to the English as Nancy Ward, a beloved woman and war leader of the Cherokee Nation. During the Revolutionary War, as the Cherokee were pressured to choose sides between the British and the Americans, Nanyehi used her diplomatic influence to advocate for peace and protect her people from violent retribution. She believed in the power of negotiation over warfare and stood against those who sought genocide against indigenous nations. She also promoted agricultural reform and women's empowerment within her community, at a time when Cherokee women traditionally held great spiritual and social power. Nancy Ward's legacy is not about loyalty to a side, but loyalty to peace and justice. Her story reminds us that Native women were not just caught in the crossfire of empire, but often stood in defiance of both it and the revolutionaries. The woman who sued for her freedom. If you're wondering when America's moral contradictions really started getting challenged, look no further than Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mbet. Born enslaved in Massachusetts, Freeman listened closely during the Revolution as her enslavers praised liberty and natural rights. In 1781, she took that language to court. She sued for her freedom, arguing that the new Massachusetts Constitution's declaration that all men are born free and equal should apply to her. And guess what? She won. Her case helped end slavery in Massachusetts, and it made her a living, breathing contradiction to America's racial caste system. Elizabeth Freeman wasn't just liberated by the Revolution. She used its very principles to liberate herself. 6. Sybil Ludington, the teenaged midnight rider. We've all heard of Paul Revere, right? But how many of us know Sybil Ludington, a 16-year-old girl who rode twice as far through the night in 1777 to warn American militia forces of an impending British attack in New York? Alone on horseback, covering nearly 40 miles through darkness and danger, Sybil rallied over 400 soldiers to prepare for battle. There were no poems written about her by Longfellow, no statues raised in every town square, but her courage and quick thinking saved lives and protected territory. Her ride reminds us that heroism doesn't always look like the paintings in museums. Sometimes it wears a cloak, rides a tired horse, and refuses to be forgotten. 7. Judith Sargent Murray, the architect of early feminism. Before Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in England, Judith Sargent Murray was doing something equally radical in America. In 1790, she published On the Equality of the Sexes, an essay arguing that women had the same intellectual potential as men, and that denying them education was a social injustice, not a natural order. She believed that women could and should participate fully in intellectual and political life. Judith didn't storm the battlefield, but she stormed the cannon. She challenged Enlightenment thinkers to put their philosophy into action and asked Americans to consider, what good is liberty if it only belongs to half the people? 8. Nancy Hart, a fierce patriot from Georgia who reportedly captured and killed loyalist soldiers spying on her community. These women and many others forged paths through a male-dominated world, pushing the boundaries of what was possible and laying groundwork for future generations. So here's the truth, raw and undeniable. America was not made by men alone. It was shaped by women of every class, colour and creed. Poets, fighters, enslaved rebels, indigenous diplomats, political theorists, and ordinary daughters who dared to become legends. Their names are not always found in monuments or textbooks, but they are woven into the DNA of this country. And when we say we love America, we must love the whole of it, including the women who bled, thought, wrote, fought, and dreamed it into being. Coming up in our final segment, we'll take a look at the legacy these foremothers left behind and how modern movements continue their unfinished work. Don't go anywhere. As we near the end of this tribute to America's foremothers, I want to pause and reflect, not just on where we've been, but where we're going. Because honouring these women isn't just about dusting off the history books or rewriting a few names in the margins. It's about recognising their legacy and asking what it means today. Their stories, though forged in the fires of revolution, are unfinished chapters, still echoing through the halls of our legislatures, classrooms, courtrooms, and homes. So let's talk about what their lives and their limitations teach us right now. If there's one thing that leaps out from the lives of women like Deborah Sampson, Mercy Otis Warren, Phyllis Wheatley, and Elizabeth Freeman, it's this: progress has never been automatic. These women were not allowed to do what they did. They insisted on it. They didn't wait for permission. They created change because they had no choice. And that's a crucial lesson today. Rights are not gifted, they're demanded. Whether we're talking about reproductive rights, voting access, education equity, or wage fairness, none of these were granted by a benevolent system. They were clawed, argued, and marched into existence. Our foremothers teach us that you do not ask for freedom politely, you assert it persistently. Let's revisit Phyllis Wheatley and Elizabeth Freeman for a moment. These were black women, one enslaved, one freed, who stood at the intersections of race, gender, and power in 18th century America. Their stories remind us that the fight for equality has never been one size fits all. Intersectionality, a term coined much later by Kimberlé Crenshaw, was lived reality for many of America's foremothers. Today, when we talk about women's rights, we cannot ignore how those rights are unequally distributed. A win for some women does not automatically mean a win for all women. So the lesson here? Our feminism must be inclusive, our history must be complex, and our liberation must be collective. The story of Betsy Ross, real or embellished, reminds us that symbols matter. They can rally people, they can inspire nations, but symbols without substance are hollow. The American flag, stitched with the mythology of liberty, flew above slave ships and denied women the right to vote for over a century. So let's be clear, waving a flag is not the same as living its values. The foremothers we've talked about today didn't just stand beside symbols, they challenged them. They asked whether the symbols matched the reality, and they dared to imagine a country where they actually could. And that's our job now, to ensure the flag means what we say it means, for everyone. Mercy Otis Warren wielded her pen. Abigail Adams used her letters. Judith Sargent Murray used her essays. Women have always found ways to speak, even when no one was listening. Fast forward to today, we live in an age where women's voices are louder, more visible, and more mobilised than ever. But visibility doesn't always equal power. Women still face underrepresentation in Congress, corporate leadership, and tech. Women of colour are still fighting for equal platform, pay and protection. Trans women are still fighting for basic recognition and safety. The lesson here is to keep speaking and keep amplifying. The Foremothers didn't whisper, they declared. So must we. Most of the women we've discussed were either self-taught or had to fight for an education. Judith Sargent Murray argued that the denial of women's education was a deliberate act of control. In modern America, education is still one of the most powerful tools for social change and still a battleground. From debates over curriculum to attacks on history itself, there's a struggle over what we teach, who we remember, and what version of America we're allowed to tell. Our foremothers understood this. They understood that knowledge, real complicated, radical knowledge, is the seed of revolution. Let's not forget, every time we correct a historical myth or elevate a forgotten name, we're doing revolutionary work. One of the most beautiful things about these women is that none of them were born into power. They were ordinary, working class, enslaved, widowed, isolated, in debt, uneducated, and yet they made history. That's the greatest lesson of all. You don't need a famous last name or a title or a statue to make a difference. You need courage, you need conviction, and you need community. Every woman listening today, every person who has ever been sidelined, underestimated, or erased, has the power to change the course of history, just like they did. We are the inheritors of unfinished work. We walk the paths cleared by Phyllis Wheatley's pen, by Sybil Ludington's midnight ride, by Deborah Sampson's defiant enlistment, by Elizabeth Freeman's lawsuit. They opened doors. We must keep them open and push through new ones. We honour them not just with words or monuments, but with action, with education, with resistance, with vision. Their stories are not just history lessons, they're marching orders. Take a breath, let this sit with you, because history isn't over, you're living it. Thank you for joining me today on Cluster Fudge for this tribute to America's foremothers. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate and share with friends who love digging into history's untold stories. I'm Alexandra. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep celebrating all the voices that make America what it is.